Hello, friends and fellow bakers. It's Chef Tom from ChefInstructorTom.com. Welcome back to the channel. I do appreciate you stopping by. Thanks for checking in. Today's quick tip deals with flour. Yeah, I use a lot of flour in my baking. I have to know which one to use when I make a product. What, you only use all-purpose flour? Oh, I get it. I understand. Well, you could do that, but it's kind of like having one-size-fits-all pants. Not the best look and definitely not the best fit. Don't you want to use the flour that fits your product the best? Of course you do. Now keep in mind, this is a quick overview and not an in-depth study. There are volumes written about each of the flours, and people dedicate their entire careers to studying flour and its properties. This is just little old me sharing some basic information with you, and I think we should get started. Well, I have some flours here. Let's talk about wheat flour first, as most bakers use wheat flour. Now, when I say wheat flour, you're probably thinking of this, whole wheat flour. I always think it's a little weird when people call this wheat flour. There's a ton of wheat flours. This one is whole wheat, meaning that it contains all the parts of the grain, the germ, the endosperm, and the bran. It can be used alone, but it makes a pretty heavy dough that some people might not like too much. It does have some gluten strength, though. You have to remember, though, because this contains the bran. That's the dark brown flecks in the flour. It cuts into the dough and makes it not as strong. It acts like a shortener. Again, it's sort of grassy and some say a bitter flavor. I think the combination of flours is what really makes things interesting when you make your doughs. I love putting rye and whole wheat flour together in my breads. You can also play with the percentages, but I would suggest that you make a note of each of the flour percentages you put together so you can reproduce it next time. Well, the next flours are the white wheat flours. Let's go from the lowest to the highest in gluten content. Now, this is cake flour. It's the lowest in gluten of all the wheat flours, and that's a good thing. You wouldn't want your cake coming out like sourdough bread. That would be nasty. It's low in gluten, and even though it does have some gluten, it's high in starch and low in gluten. It's great for cakes. Obviously, that's why they call it cake flour. But it's also great for lowering the gluten strength of your cookies or pie doughs. You can add a little bit to lower the gluten in each of your products. You can also tell it's cake flour because it clumps when you squeeze it. It's super, super white. That clumping is the starch clumping up. This is one of the reasons why we would sift our cake flour. Always sift your cake flour. Now this one is pastry flour. It's somewhere between cake and bread flour in gluten content. It's great for cookies and pie dough. It's got some gluten, but not quite as much as bread flour or all-purpose flour. You'll see it starting to get a little creamier than the cake flour in color. It too will clump because that's starch, and you'll need to sift your pastry flour if you're using it. Most people don't have access to pastry flour. It's used in bakeries mostly. Now, all-purpose here doesn't look that much different than pastry flour, but it will make a really good cake, a pie dough, cookie, bread, anything else you want to make. And that's why they call it all-purpose flour. It's got sort of a medium gluten and a starch content. I have to tell you, on one side note, during the pandemic lockdown, all I could find was all-purpose flour. I was freaking out. There was no bread flour available at all. So I did all my breads with all-purpose flour. And they were great. They turned out really, really good. I was so amazed at the versatility of all-purpose. I do still prefer the bread flour for breads, but the AP was not that bad. So you can use AP for anything that calls for flour. Now let's talk about bread flour. This is easily my favorite. Bread flour has the most protein and the least starch of all the wheat flours. It contains the highest percentage of gluten-forming properties of all the flours. This means when you mix it with water, it gets very stretchy and very strong. Cake flour is weak, and a bread flour is very, very strong. What's also very cool is just by mixing up some water and this flour, the bread flour, you can let it sit and it will still develop gluten. This means we can trap gas from yeast to make beautiful, beautiful breads. Now there's also high gluten flour, which is used to make bagels and stronger breads. This is kind of a specialty formulation, and most home bakers are never going to use that. But one thing the home baker can use to kind of strengthen their flour is this stuff. It's vital wheat gluten. It is really good, and I use it, and I call it my Gluten Helper. Just add a little bit to yeast doughs to make them even stronger. Very small, like a less than 1%. I would caution you to be careful using this stuff as it can make your breads very, very stiff and unmanageable if you overdo it. Be careful. Well, what else is there? Well, there's semolina flour for pasta. I don't use that a lot, but it's another strong flour made from durum wheat. There's all kinds of specialty flours made from mills across the country, and they do get pretty pricey. When you're used to paying 50 cents a pound for flour and you see it for $3 a pound, you kind of freak out. One last flour I really love is 00. It's used for making pizza mostly. If you saw last week's video, I made biscuits from this very soft flour. It's strong flour, but very soft. It's ground much finer, so it seems much different than the other flours. It also absorbs water less than bread flour does, so you need to use less water to get the same texture you would use for bread flour. It's mainly used for making pizza, but the biscuits came out pretty good too. I hope you made the biscuits. I had been ordering the Caputo, that's the Italian 00 flour. It's pretty expensive and a little harder to find in my area, but recently King Arthur started selling it in the grocery store. Yay for me, finally. So I don't have to drive anymore. As far as brands go, I try to stick to King Arthur. It's a consistent product that a lot of my colleagues use, so it's easy to adapt formulas from one baker to another. You can use the grocery store product, but I find it's not quite as consistent in flavor or texture. It is much cheaper though, so if you're on a budget, it's a good flour to use. There's nothing wrong with it at all. I do also enjoy Bob's Red Mill products. They have great flavor and consistency as well. Both King Arthur and Bob's Red Mill have a full line of flours, both wheat-based and gluten-free. Have a look at their websites. I'll link below. I think you'll see some flours you've never heard of before. Well, let's finish up by talking about some transitional flours. Now, I love using rye flour in my bread and my pastries for some things. It has some gluten, but it's very fragile gluten. I wouldn't use maybe more than 25% in my breads. Could you use 100%? You could, but it makes very crumbly bread. It is nice in cookies and pie doughs as long as your clientele, maybe your family, doesn't mind. But some people really, really hate rye. I love the flavor. It's cool either way. If you love rye, eat it. If you don't love rye, that's fine too. It can be definitely used in yeast bread. You can use spelt flour. This is spelt flour. It has a grassy flavor as well. And when you combine it with a wheat flour, it makes a beautiful dough. You can even make pastries with it. That is, if you don't mind the flavor. I kind of like it. Now, a lot of people ask me about storing flour and how long can you keep the flour. I like to store the flour in these canisters. These are airtight, watertight canisters. You definitely don't want moisture or critters getting into your flour, and that will keep your flour much, much longer. How long can I keep it in these canisters? Well, I wouldn't keep it more than, say, 3 months. And if you're smart, you'll go through your flour pretty quickly. If you don't use that much flour, buy a small quantity and use it up and then buy some more. You can keep it longer without too much decrease in flavor or texture, but I wouldn't recommend it. Flour is a perishable product. It will go bad eventually. Try not to buy more than you need. Just use it up in 3 months. Simple as that. Well, that's a quick overview of flours and their usage. The bottom line is to use the right flour for the product you're making and keep your flour fresh. Be sure to put some questions and comments below. Like and subscribe. Thank you. I'll see you next week on Chef Instructor Tom. Happy baking.